are the armies of the night.
I say the future is ours!
100,000 strong.
Now there ain't but 20,000 police in the whole town!
They outnumber the cops 5 to 1.
It's all our turf!
They could run New York City. Tonight, they're out to get the Warriors. The Warriors, rated R.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Non-Content Podcast as part of the From the Q podcasting network. My name is Jerome Q-san, and joining me, as always, is Brian. Tonight, we are going to be discussing 1979's The Warriors. We are celebrating the 45th anniversary as this movie came out in 1979, and I cannot get Brian to watch Apocalypse Now. So this will be our 1979 movie, but what a movie it is. I remember thinking back a few weeks ago, seeing Alien Romulus, seeing Walter Hill's name up on the screen, and thinking about, how old is he? He is 82 years old. He is still with us. And I thought that we should pay tribute to Walter Hill by looking at two of his, I would say, best-known films at this point. These have become cult classics in the truest sense of the word. The first cult classic, of course, is 1979's The Warrior. And if there is ever a director who can do urban decay and subway scenes, it is one Walter Hill. He does an unbelievable job, not to mention the phenomenal work in terms of the soundtracks, which will be a running theme of both this week and next week. But Brian, we are here to talk about The Warriors. Not a lot of famous faces. I mean, I would say James Remar is probably the best known of the performers. I would also say David Patrick Kelly also is somebody that I know that you're a huge fan of as well. But this movie it's not about the actors. It's not really about the script. But Brian, if there is ever an all-time great vibe movie, this is the one.
Yeah, this is okay, so it's kind of like the end of the disco era going into the 80s synth kind of era. So the music is this kind of hybrid of funk, rock, and end of that disco kind of phase to it. And it's got it's a dancing vibe, but a cool rock vibe. So the music is unbelievable, and it just fits the tone of this movie so well. And the cinematography is unbelievable because a lot of it's shot at night, but everything is not brightly lit, but the colors pop. So they shot it really well because some of the scenes, like I said, the subway scenes a lot of the time come up dark and stuff like that. But with the costumes, it just makes the picture pop so well, especially with all the different gangs having all these different costumes and stuff like that. I think visually this movie is one of a kind. I think it has a lot of influence on pro wrestling and sports, obviously. Just the idea of uniformity and the gangs and the looks. And you can't help but think of when you think of the gangs in this movie, each gang's got this individual identity, and I can't help but think of the NWO coming out to 7 NWO black and white T-shirts all coming out at the same time as this gang. So you can't help but think of wrestling sometimes when it comes to these things, and the idea that the baseball bat with the baseball Furies, you can't help but think that maybe Sting and the NWO got influenced by that, the gang warfare with that. I mean, this movie has a lot of cool visuals and a lot of cool ideas to it. I'm actually more fascinated with the first act more than anything because of the social implications of it all, which we'll get into in a second. But man, I think this movie really stands the test of time and ages well like a fine wine. The picture quality has gotten better throughout the transfers throughout the years, and we'll talk about the different cuts and stuff like that. But man, I think over time, I think the 4K Aero version is the definitive version at this point that just came out last year. So I would recommend checking that out. We check out the version on HD on Amazon Prime, which is connected to the Paramount Plus app. So we didn't get the absolute cleanest version, but if you pay the extra money, it's going to look really good on the 4K.
Yeah, I'm strongly considering actually getting the 4K of both this and Streets of Fire. This is just a great movie just in terms of, again, the vibes. If you're looking for a great plot, I don't know that you're necessarily going to get it, but you're going to get a lot of very interesting visuals. You're going to get some great, some fun chase scenes. A subgroup of the Warriors potentially being murdered by a group of women in an apartment, and just how tough they are, and how there's a scene of it's not as bad as it could have been given it's 1979. But I feel even though it's a fight against women, it doesn't feel as dirty as it should. There are definitely some moments of course, you have James Remar using the epithet for gay people multiple times in this movie, which definitely has not aged well. And of course, he gets real pervy with a cop and gets justifiably arrested. Like, here's the thing: I think the cops are portrayed as generally being bad, but what he does, I mean, he's pretty vulgar to that woman. He deserves to get arrested and thrown in jail. Like, Ajax deserves everything he gets for his actions.
Yeah, it's almost like the Shakespearean thing about claiming the throne, because at that point it's all about Swan taking over leadership because the other guy got we didn't see him die, but he got caught being blamed for the death of Cyrus. But it's just one of these things where it's all about the miscommunication of it all, and this guy that James Remar plays, like, he's one of those scumbags, and he's obviously the scumbag of the team, quote unquote, the guy that you're not really rooting for, and he's kind of like the Scar trying to get the throne of the leadership or whatever, and you can kind of tell he wants that, and he's like power hungry and stuff like that, but then he just gets what he deserves, and it's totally justifiable. And then you get to focus on like the more positive characters of the group, and they do kind of eliminate some people from the group at the beginning. They get rid of one person, they get rid of another character in the middle who gets run over by a train. You don't see it, but it's pretty gnarly the way they shoot it. And then of course James Remar getting arrested, but everyone else kind of seems to be good guys, quote unquote, and save the day. But it's just really cool because it's almost like I would say like the Odyssey, the Greek story, the Greek myth. It's just this giant odyssey of like Homer trying to get back or whatever, and it's kind of like you go through these obstacles, and they even have sirens, quote unquote, and those are the Lizzies, pretty much, because they were seducing them, and they were seducing them with music and dance, right? So that's it's got that Greek feeling to it, and that's kind of what that director's cut has. And it's like a feeling of like they try to introduce it as almost like this Greek myth that takes place in New York. So they have all these like comic book transitions and stuff like that. There's a different narrating intro, and that's the version I grew up on, because this DVD came out in 2005. That's about around the time that I saw it, and then I rented it. And then I recall renting the game as well, a little after this too, which is about worth like $100 now because it didn't sell a lot when it first came out, but now there's like a big cult following. Who would have thunk it? A cult following on the Warriors for the video game as well. So that's a really interesting story too. But yeah, I think the distribution of this movie has been kind of different, because I think for a certain amount of people, like when they saw it in 2005, we're used to this ultimate director's cut. And now that HD has come around to do just the normal streaming, I just saw the theatrical cut for the first time in a long time. So that was interesting. And I don't know if Jerome's actually seen the director's cut, but I highly recommend checking that out. And it looks like they're both finally available together on the Arrow one. There was the Blu-ray that I have has the director's cut, and that's it. I believe that's it. But that was from like a 10 years ago release. So all these different releases of the movie over the years, but it's just cool to see like the picture quality to get better and better and better. Because this version that I saw just now on my big TV in the living room was unbelievable. So I got to recommend seeing it on the biggest screen possible. Turn the speakers up because the soundtrack's bopping, and there's a lot of cool visual stuff about this movie. Performance-wise, is good. You know what I'm saying? But I would say the most interesting part is at the beginning. What you say, because there's a lot of like social, political. I don't know, like,
for sure. I mean, I would say for me, I think oddly enough, Roger Hill's probably giving the best performance, and he's kind of the only one that he gets the big speech at the beginning, and he's talking about solidarity among the gangs to take over New York, and it's just this really interesting thing because, like, for a lot of the movie, you're just thinking, is New York just divided up into these series of gangs? And then you realize, no, the police are around, and there are definitely people that are not involved in the gangs. And I would have to imagine with a bigger budget, like, you would get an even better idea of what the city looks like. But even with this being such a low budget, you still get a really good sense of the urban decay of the city. And I think that's portrayed extremely well. And again, I feel like this is the type of movie where if they remade it, they would like try to attach all this lore to it and just ruin it. But I think the essence, the greatness of this movie is its simplicity, and the fact that the density comes from like the visuals and the colors and the soundtrack, and just the fact that there are so many characters. Like, to me, this movie is kind of the antithesis of the things that I think you and I really appreciate, because this movie is not about having a really good script. It's not even necessarily about great individual performance, but this movie is so much about the vibes and the scenes and the action and just the feeling that you get when you're watching this, because it's a really fun movie to watch. I love the fact that it's 90 minutes long and the movie gets in, gets out. And I just have a real appreciation because this is such a different movie than typically ones I'm into. And I think, we're going to get into the soundtrack at some point. But to me, I think the vibes are the thing that sell me on the greatness of this movie because, I don't like when I think back on this, I don't necessarily remember like individual characters. Like I remember how badass the Warriors come across. I mean, I think their vests rule. Like the vests really give that vibe of they are the baddest group among all these badass groups. I mean, the costume design also, which contributes to the vibes a great deal. Like, I think it's really cool that you have like the baseball group. You have the group that all wears overalls, and some of them have roller skates, and you have the other ones that kind of wear the plain t-shirts. But in their case, like the vests just make them look like total badasses, and they're shirtless. I mean, they're not ridiculously muscular and having to do like human growth hormone to maintain a crazy physique, but like they still come across like complete badasses, and that's what you want. Like the Warriors are the underdogs of this movie to an extent because basically they are framed for killing Cyrus at the beginning, and then they're kind of on their own. But like it is very clear that they are the strongest group, and that's why the other characters or some of the other groups want to take them down.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating thing because you think about like Game of Death, Bruce Lee's Game of Death, but I mean, it wasn't a completed movie, but they found the footage later on. But it's the idea that you're going through the tower, one level at a time, which they incorporated also into John Wick, and then of course John Wick also took the idea of Nowhere to Run from this soundtrack as well. The same concept of like instead of the Warriors, essentially it's just John Wick trying to get through the city. So it's the same concept. So I like how that John Wick kind of adapted that, paid homage to that. As well with like a DJ and playing the song and everything. I was the only one in the theater I felt like that knew the reference to the Warriors, and even Jerome didn't even know that it was a reference to the Warriors until he rewatched the Warriors recently. So that was really really cool. And I really find the first act really fascinating. It's this idea that Cyrus is this guy who's like the leader of the leaders, like the leader of all the gangs or so. I don't know. But like he's got this idea that he wants to unite all the gangs, and if you unite every single gang in New York, you outnumber all the cops. And I always found it so fascinating. And it's this idea of essentially some kind of like socialism amongst gangsters or gangs or something like that. And this idea that we want to bring all the different minorities and different groups together and unite as one, and then we can take all the power together. Right? That's very like socialism right there. And then the one guy that takes it all out is David Patrick Kelly, the leader of his group, and his group seems to be like all white people who just want to cause chaos and just want to cause anarchy for no reason at all. Sound familiar? And fucking just nail them. And they're not even supposed to have guns in place anyway. It was kind of like a peace treaty, and so they were the only one with a gun, and they shoot him, and then they blame it on the Warriors. So I'm just thinking this whole time, it's like, well. Again, here we go. We got a guy trying to unite the whole country, minorities included, and we got this one group of white people that just said no and fucked it all up. So that's very poignant. It's still very poignant today. Yeah, this first act is just so like fascinating to me because in a different universe, you would think that like there is a movie where the gangs do take over and they unite, and it's almost like Escape from New York, like you mentioned too, which is very funny because the very next movie they recommended on Amazon Prime was Escape from New York. I don't know if they did that for you too, but it's got that vibe too. It's like almost the same universe, 30, 40 years apart. But yeah.
I was watching Paramount Plus, and they tried to send me to Jack Reacher, which was a very odd choice. I mean, look, as I stated to you, I want a crossover between the Warriors and Escape from New York. That would be a fantastic idea. Unfortunately, we probably couldn't get it right because it's 2024, and we don't know how to make movies without using bajillions amounts of CGI. But back in the day, would have been the coolest idea ever. Have Snake Plissken fighting these gangs, the gangs interacting with the elements of Escape from New York. What a fantastic idea that should probably never happen at this point. But Brian, we do have to talk about the soundtrack, and I know there is a clear connection with John Wick 4, but my goodness, usually when you remake a song, it's a mixed bag, but this version of Nowhere to Run is just perfectly calibrated for this movie, and it really adds to the feeling of danger. And I mean, again, just I love the idea that the Warriors get separated because of the subway and because of the cops. It's just it works out so well, and kind of dividing them up and kind of exploring these different elements. I mean, I feel like with a little bit more time, we could have explored even more gangs. But again, I think the simplicity is what makes this movie so good. And the thing that I appreciate about the soundtrack is that it really does match the vibe of what is happening in the movie. And even though it's kind of a needle drop, I think that one of the biggest problems I have with needle drops these days is they both feel like they either feel like random or they feel like they're so obvious. But in this case, like you get this kind of newer version of a song, and it really captures the feeling of the scene, and that's what makes the soundtrack so good. That's what makes any soundtrack so good.
Yeah, so it's Nowhere to Run, came out in 1965, originally sang by the Vandellas. This is the a cover of that, and then the one on John Wick is also a cover of the cover. So it just fits like this idea of running through the city. That's why John Wick stole it. It's just the perfect song for that kind of idea, this odyssey, so to speak. But there's other great songs on the soundtrack too that just really like fit the tone. So like there's another song called In Havana that kind of plays in the background. That's that it's Cuba, and then of course there's like this the Latin side of New York. That's why some of the casting they did some of the casting based on what you see. Like they wanted some of that Puerto Rican kind of casting as well because of New York. So there's songs like In Havana. And then the Barry DeVarzon, he's the actual one that does like the score part of it, the synth score, and he does like all over the beginning, middle, and end of this movie. And then you got the Baseball Furies Chase that he does as well. And I think the best, well, there's another awesome song too, Love Is a Fire. That's the one where you have the one dancing with the Lizzies before they attack the three warriors in the apartment. And Love Is a Fire, the way that song just builds up and builds up and builds up to the moment. I think it's an amazing song that no one's really heard of, but it's on the soundtrack as well. And then you got In the City by Joe Walsh, and Joe Walsh is a member of the Eagles. But this song, if you listen to the recording, it sounds like they recorded it in a subway. Like the beginning has like opening tracks to a subway. You can hear like the tracks, the physical tracks of the subway train, and then mixed in with like a train in the background. All of a sudden the song just kicks in. So it's like, oh my God, that sounds like it just like recorded the song in the middle of the movie or something like that, because it just fits so well. And In the City's become like this really like cult like rock classic. And it's kind of like a cult classic because the Eagles are this big band from the last 40 years, right? But Joe Walsh as a solo hasn't had as many songs. He's had a few big hits, but usually the Eagles stuff kind of stands out the most. But in this case, I think this is like some of his best work he's ever done, In the City. And he gets solo credit for it outside the band. So I think that's a really cool aspect of this soundtrack, because this Joe Walsh track is just unbelievable. And the Eagles at the time were on the rise to being one of the biggest selling bands of all time. I think around this time, their greatest hits album was about to be the number one selling album of all time up until that point. So the Eagles were a big deal. And it's only got 10 tracks listed, but there's an extended like version of the soundtrack as well. But man, it's got these amazing synth scores, and I mentioned the music's time period to kind of go to correlate with that. So this soundtrack is like unbelievable with so many like great songs that one after another, including the synth score. So to me, like the score is like a 9 out of 10, underrated classic. A lot of people don't like refer to this movie with as a classic like movie soundtrack. People talk about Grease, people talk about like Pulp Fiction, but never never this movie. So I feel like the Warriors deserve a lot of credit for having an underrated cult heavy soundtrack.
For sure. I think again when it comes to this movie, there really isn't a lot else to talk about, because again, to me, this is vibes, it's soundtrack, it's also production design. The look of the subway on this in this movie, and the fact that again they're able to do this with such a low budget is so impressive to me, because you just really feel the dirt and the grime. And that's the thing about the movie that Walter Hill executive produced in 1979, Alien. That's the magic of Alien, is that that ship feels very dirty and grimy, and it feels like you're very lived in, and that's what I think we miss with a lot of the ways that movies are shot today. Is we miss those fun elements of like dirt and grime. And I know that's a really strange thing to complain about, but it really feels like that's the magic of movie making, is giving the lived in vibe. And New York, I mean, there's always the joke about, New York feels like a character in this movie, but this version of New York feels very much in tune with what was happening at the time, but also feels like, if neoliberalism had cleaned up the city, then this is what it could have turned into. But yeah, I just really appreciate just the those production design elements that give us the feeling of like this is a place that people are living.
Yeah, I mean, Walter Hill really loves to shoot like underneath bridges. And you'll see a lot of that in Streets of Fire, but like the metal fucking legs of a bridge is, I don't know. He loves shooting them, man. And you see a lot of that in New York, so it just kind of fit the look of this movie. And then, yeah, you mentioned the dirtiness and the grittiness, and you see a lot of that in the train sequence towards the end, where they see that clean couple from whatever dance they just went to, and the warriors are dirty and the girl's dirty, and they're just kind of like looking at each other, and she's about to fix her hair, and Swan stops her, just says, "Just be as you are." That was a really cool scene, and that kind of reflects the dirtiness you're talking about and how dirty the subways were in the 70s, and I'm sure they haven't gotten too much better in the 80s, maybe the 90s, but at least they got that look down, and it's like they just didn't even bother to like fix up any of the subways. That's how they just naturally look. So I thought, well, that's a really cool aspect of the movie. It just looks so natural. It looks like the total like authentic New York subway, and they have a lot of subway shots, believe me, because this trek is 30 miles, which is a hell of a journey, believe me, to go from train to train to train. So it's part of the journey too. So this idea going from train station to train station, it's really like the script is not a great script, but it's a well thought out like movie outline of to get from A to B, right? Kind of like a Mad Max Furiosa kind of idea where we just go from A to B and that's it, and we just have all this action in between. So that was really cool in terms of the concept for this movie. Yeah, I think it's like an 8.5 out of 10 for me. Personally, I just think that a lot of just the technical aspects and the music and the colors are just unbelievable. In terms of casting, like you said, like everything is fine. I think David Patrick Kelly's the standout for me, obviously, because he's this amazing character actor from the 80s and 90s. And if I guess one of his more familiar roles is this, because he goes, "Warriors come out to play with the bottles," right? And I swear to God, I've seen someone call out the Road Warriors in some 80s promo doing that. I don't know if saw it from Kevin Sullivan in Florida, or maybe someone in the Carolinas calling out the Road Warriors or something. But that I've definitely heard that before, calling out the Road Warriors, and that was really like a really cool moment. Like I said, this movie does influence wrestling somewhat in terms of the looks, so that was a really cool thing. I couldn't find the clip. I tried to find it somewhere, but swear to God, it's out there, folks. But yeah, I think this movie just stands the test of time, man. I think it just gets better and better, and then you get so many creative ideas, because it feels like every time you watch this movie, there's some little detail you don't notice, something in the background. Like this time around, I noticed all the ads for like the food places around New York that I'd never noticed before in the train sequences. It's the little background things like that too. And then of course, like, the costume design, you're always going to miss something in terms of these costumes because they're so like detailed, but you have hardly any time to see them up close. And then one thing I also want to mention is that anytime that you have a limited budget, but you want to make things seem much bigger, like I said before, just get a bunch of extras in one shot. In the beginning of the movie is like 200 extras in the middle of this park at like midnight in New York, and it just looks like this big budget thing when they were on a limited budget. So it's one of those things that I think is still relevant today to teach, because like I see this technique used in movies and stuff, but it's usually a digital copy of like 3 or 4 people filling up a whole group of people, right? It's not authentic. So I think it's more authentic when you just pay your extras, get 200 people in a single shoot in one night and just film them, and then it just looks like this big production budget, that you're spending all this money on, when really it's just like you're just limiting the time with your extras basically. But that's my opinion on like shooting for like, to make things seem much more big budget than they are, obviously. But I think they use that technique very well, and especially with all the gangs and stuff. Whenever there's like wide shots, they always have a lot of people in the wide shots. He's like, see 15 members of a gang here with the Warriors in the foreground. So it's like so many people in the shot. It just feels like so much bigger than it is.
Definitely. I would say that there's a lot of things that work about this movie, but I can't help but think about how the synth score sounds like the ECW theme, and I don't know if that's on purpose or not.
Probably purposeful, because ECW was pulling from a lot of things. Like I said, Warriors influenced a lot
They
of
certainly
wrestling.
were, for sure. But yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, this is not a movie. I don't have a lot of hot takes because I think it's just it's a vibe movie, and I think it's really excellent. But certainly, if you are the type of person who appreciates more, let's say, character-driven and dialogue-driven movies, this is probably not going to be your thing necessarily. But maybe next week's will, because we next week we are going to get into some neo noir territory. We're going to also examine urban decay, just like we did this week, and a little bit of gang warfare as well. Maybe next week's like the Disciples of the Apocalypse. Like this week, I don't know. I don't really have a good like wrestling connection, but next week, Disciples of Apocalypse, I guess we'll.
I guess we got to go NWO. I mean, they got the NWO had the look of like a gang. They were all uniform colored. Sting had the bat. Sting was kind of like a baseball fury onto his own. I'm telling you, this had some kind of subconscious influence on the NWO angle, and obviously the gang warfare stuff in WWF in '97. But I don't know. I just feel like they just watched this movie one night, and Scott Hall and Kevin Nash started getting all these ideas, because I think Scott Hall and Kevin Nash were the ones that probably had the better creative ideas.
Scott Hall allegedly, and there's been some things to disprove this, but apparently, like Scott Hall's always the one that's mentioned as far as like recommending Sting become the Crow and whatever. So I don't know. I don't even know if that's true at this point, but
It would make sense to me, because, like I said, this has it all in terms of pro wrestling, especially the beginning. If you watch the beginning and see all the different groups getting ready, it's almost like it's like a hype video for like a War Games or something, with all these teams getting together. So they did it well. They did it very well, and yeah, I really appreciate the. Also, I appreciate the DJ, because she's the what's her name? I forget her name, but she is Lynn Thigpen. She's also from Carmen Sandiego. So if you ever watch Carmen Sandiego as a kid, she's the one that kind of like dictates the show. And she's also in Streets of Fire, which we'll talk about next week. And then, of course, they kind of play homage to her character in John Wick 4. So that was really cool. And it's funny, too, because the Warriors are probably not even listening to music at all. They're probably not even listening to the radio, except all the other gangs are. So it's this idea that the DJ is giving live updates on the gang warfare during the radio broadcast is like such a cool idea to me. Yeah, I always thought that was like a really cool touch, because it's something they probably added like post. You didn't have to necessarily do it during the shoot. You could just add it during post, and it just made it more cool for the movie.
all right. So that is it for our discussion of the Warriors. For Brian, I'm Jerome. We will talk to you again next week for Streets of Fire.